Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So a new poll, or I guess you can't call it a poll, I guess you can call it a ranking. The Washington Post is looking out and is asking the question, a year from the previous election, who do we believe has the best shot at exceeding the primaries and going up against Donald Trump? I have a picture up here with a guy with a little S coming off of his chest. So I give you 3 guesses as to who's number 1 on that list. Now, this is a remarkable sea change. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that the Washington Post, Democratic Party, that these organizations are trying to leverage Sanders for their own level of popularity, and this idea of trying to sheepdog people into the party itself. Hey, we're hip, we're cool, we like Bernie Sanders. You can come on back to the party. We've changed. We haven't changed. We've changed. We've changed. I think what the Washington Post is picking up on is something that I think the public itself recognizes, or at the very least feels. There's been a sea change in the conversations that's taken place with regards to politics. Let's take a look at the story for a moment. Let's see. The top 15 Democratic presidential candidates for 2020 ranked. Now, of course, you have Kamala Harris, you have Cory Booker and Elizabeth Warren. They even have Terry McAuliffe on this list. But like I said before, number 1 is Bernie Sanders. Number 2 is Joe Biden. This does seem to be the way this is squaring up. Now, I've made mention before that Richard Wolff came out saying that Bernie Sanders was going to run in 2020. Beyond Richard Wolff saying that Bernie Sanders was going to run in 2020, you have The Hill coming out with an article saying that Bernie Sanders believes that it's his turn and that he doesn't want Joe Biden to try to take it. Meaning, at the very least, this far out, they've been thinking about the politics of what's going to take place in 2020. And these guys have been maneuvering with this idea of trying to jockey for position in 2020. This is more straightforward for Joe Biden because Joe Biden will probably get the establishment support. Kirsten Gillibrand, one of them. Sanders is a little bit more tricky. Ultimately, part of the war that Sanders has been fighting, and this battle that Sanders has been fighting, is with the Unity Commission. Now, whether you think anything is going to come of it or not, this is the path that he's chosen to try to fight this battle, meaning getting rid of superdelegates and getting rid of or opening the primaries. Right now, we have no idea what's going to take place. It is it looks as if Democrats have like a 16-point lead in regards to the House of Representatives, and even a lead in regards to the Senate, meaning it's likely, or it's a very good potential that Democrats could take the House and take the Senate. I've made this contention that if they have the capacity to do that, then this idea of a Unity Reform Commission, the impetus to do anything in this goes away. This far out, within a year, they're going to have the elections again. What is the impetus for Democrats to change if they understand that based on polling that people are going to run back to the Democratic Party? That's all I'm getting at. The tension that's created with Democrats losing, that tension, that force, that torque, is the thing that pushes them along and compels them to do something. It's the stick. It's that specter that hangs outside of the room of the Unity Reform Commission, understanding that with that many people leaving the party, their capacity to win elections, well, they've lost 1,100 seats, so that gives you this idea on their capacity to win elections. But you understand that if that specter goes away, the boogeyman that's outside the hallway, that's if you don't do right by X, Y, Z, these demographics, then you're not going to get those people back into the party. You're not going to con those people back into the party. If that goes away, meaning if they're looking at polls, they see themselves 15, 16, 17 points ahead already, what's the impetus for them to change? What's the impetus to change? That's somewhat of a tangent. I guess the point I'm getting at is Sanders is trying to fight this war from the standpoint of superdelegates, open primaries. The Washington Post has this comical section saying that he's trying to beef up on things that hampered him in the last election cycle. I like this. It must free from politicals Gabriel Benedetti recently show how Sanders conspicuously seems to be addressing the shortcomings that hampered his candidacy in 2016. most notably his lack of familiarity with foreign policy. Now, as I read that, I first thought to myself, you mean the cheating? Yeah, he's trying to remedy the cheating. He's trying to get rid of this idea of superdelegates and this idea of close primaries. Yes, he's trying to remedy the cheating, the instantiated cheating that's a part of the Democratic Party itself, using this apparatus of a Unity Reform Commission. Washington Post doesn't bring that up. They don't bring that up at all. They are saying that he's interacting with pro-democratic groups, American Federations of Teachers, and he's done nothing to diminish the speculation that he'll run again. Well, like I said, the other articles, you don't have to look that far to find articles saying that Bernie Sanders is doing things that gets across this idea that he will most likely be running in 2020. Just to be clear, though, the Washington Post is not a friend of Bernie Sanders. They may be running the story, but they're not a friend of Bernie Sanders. The closer that this election gets, the more they're going to be trying to stick shivs and knives and nails and everything else into Bernie Sanders. They're going to try to stick things into Bernie Sanders to hobble his chances of getting elected because, let's be honest, Washington Post is an establishment rag. They are. They're a Democratic rag. They're not going to support Sanders in this way. They are going to actively go after him and punitively go after him. And his supporters and people who want something fundamentally different in that office needs to be prepared for that, because this will change on a dime the closer we get to the election. So they may be touting him now as being number one. And let's be fair to Sanders for the moment. I know there's a lot of people who are like, oh, dude, you're worshiping that guy. It's being honest. I mean, it's being honest. We're having a fundamentally different conversation than we were having in 2008. Be honest. You may think that he's a sheepdog. I've used that term myself, and I agree with that term. You may think that he was complicit in the cheating. You may think that he was an asshole because he didn't call out the cheating. You may think that he was part of the scam. You may think all sorts of stuff. But let's be very honest. If you're going to think of that stuff, you need to have context in the way that you're thinking about it, at least being fair. Otherwise, you know, it's like I have an unfair opinion about Bernie Sanders, because I don't like Bernie Sanders, I'm going to pretend as if the things that he was responsible for, he was in no way responsible for. It's like, come on, be honest. Ultimately, the conversations that you're having now has been pushed to the left. You're not just talking about a quote-unquote public option or Obamacare. You're actually talking about Medicare for all or universal health care. You're not talking about somebody who gives these piecemeal things to unions. You're talking about somebody who actually is a full and true believer in this idea of representing and supporting and being on the picket line with those unions. I mean, this is a sea change. This is a sea change. You're not talking about just, you know, student debt is an act of God. You're talking about somebody who's actively talking about making college tuition free. The same way we have elementary school, the same way we have high school, to add that and say, hey, our society is better off in the same way that it's better off when kids can go to elementary and middle school and high school to be able to get secondary education without going into $50,000, $60,000 in debt. My point is, this is fundamentally different. That's all. That's my point. And considering that many of these lists, even after the 2016 election, even after Sanders showing, still didn't include Bernie Sanders on those lists. So whether the Washington Post is trying to sheepdog, whether the Washington Post is trying to make some kind of connection between Sanders and the Democratic Party in order to kind of mail those in to make people think that those things are similar, whatever their reasons for doing it, I don't necessarily care their reasons. Ultimately, they're doing it. Bernie Sanders, #1 ranked to run or to win the primary in 2020. Like I said, it wasn't going to be long. It's just an interesting heads up. It's just an interesting heads up. I should have did this live. I like having... I think the conversation on Sanders is important. I honestly think it's an important conversation, because I think it's a conversation that's going to come up and be more filled out in 2020. He is the most popular senator in spades in this country, hands down. Don't compete. He was going to pull independents. He's going to pull Democrats, and I suspect he's also going to pull full-on lefties. Whatever these people are saying right now, when it comes down to brass tacks, they're going to go into that booth. They may cry at 3 in the morning after they do it, but they're going to pull that lever for Bernie Sanders. and Bernie Sanders will be the next president of the United States, providing Bernie Sanders doesn't get cheated in the primaries again, and providing that people have somewhat of a backbone and are willing to stand by this thing of, I am not voting for anybody who doesn't represent my interests, meaning it's either Sanders or it's a Dem exit. At least that's my position. So I will leave it at that. Or Tulsi Gabbard. I'm okay with Gabbard. And I'm okay with Turner. But yeah, it's a thin list. It is a thin list for me. Otherwise, I will be voting once again for Jill Stein. And proud to do so. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Like I said, this one wasn't going to be long. This is just, hey, the Washington Post says Bernie Sanders is #1 chance or #1 person to run in the primaries. Considering that beforehand, they didn't even put the guy on the list. And considering beforehand that the conversations we were having was, oh, this is pie in the sky, oh, this can't never work, and blah, 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 blah. And now, a socialist is the #1 person who's expected or who's giving the #1 potential to take the Democratic primary. That's amazing. That's amazing. So, again, you know, just because they're projecting it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And all of these guys saying in the same way Hillary Clinton was inevitable can't necessarily take it as true. It's just what they're thinking. What, 3 years out? Who the fuck knows what's going to happen in 3 years? But I do think there's something fundamentally different when a socialist in the paper of record, the rag, the Washington Post. And that rag is at very least acknowledging, okay, you lefties were right. The socialist would have been a better option. So, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm big enough of a person to not say I told you so. Big enough a person to not say I told you so. I'm not going to say that. Not going to say that. So, I will just leave it at that. Alright guys, if you enjoy the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support through Patreon. And yeah, I did tell you so. We told you so. We told you she was going to lose. We told you this guy was the most popular and this guy was the best matchup. And now they finally come to heel to the same recognition. I'll take it. I'll take it. Alright guys, have a good one.